Welcome to this edition of OBG Talks. My name's Oliver Cornock, and today I'm joined by Harry Van Schaik, our Latin America region editor. Hi, Harry.
Hi there, Oliver. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. So straight to Mexico City, where you are. We keep reading that Latin America and Mexico are further behind the curve of some of the European countries and indeed Asia in terms of COVID-19. How's it in Mexico City?
Well, I think we've been rather lucky compared to many other countries in Latin America. We're still allowed to go out onto the streets and perhaps collected the odd takeaway coffee, for example, and nothing that we've seen in Peru or Colombia, where the lockdowns are almost kind of total. And so we have been very lucky in that sense. But as you rightly mentioned, the curve is kind of creeping up, and we're now kind of in late May-ish, we're now kind of almost about reaching the peak in Mexico City, which is the world's fifth largest city. So obviously there's a lot of challenges around that. Other regions of Mexico have not been so hard hit, and so they're kind of opening up again. So it's a kind of a bit of a mixed picture, but from where I am in Mexico City, things are kind of doing okay, but we're just hitting the curve right now.
Sure. One of the things we're going to touch on in this edition of ABG Talks is supply chains and trade. And before we do that, I just looking through the news. There's been a cranking up of USChina rhetoric over the last 48 hours. There's an election looming in the US towards the end of this year. The last election that Donald Trump fought was very much on a platform of build a wall. You're in Mexico. Do you see it inevitable at some point that Mexico will be drawn in as some part of the Trumpian rhetoric?
Well, that's a very interesting point. And I actually think the anti-China dialogue that's coming from the White House at the moment might actually favor Mexico, because it seems like Trump is setting himself up to kind of talk about China as the enemy in kind of public health terms, but also in economic terms. So that actually might benefit Mexico. And then the second part of this is also the fact that Mexico has been through a number of years of negotiations with Trump, the Trump administration, and also Canada to kind of create this new NAFTA, which is known as the USMCA, which is coming into effect in the 1st of July. So, and that fact that is coming into effect in an election year actually might benefit Mexico and maybe lead Trump to discuss how fantastic the relations are in both economic and political terms with their southern neighbor.
And just on the back of that, how's AMLO faring in this in terms of his domestic appeal, particularly to the private sector, particularly to the business sector?
Well, I think there's definitely, I think you touched on something there that's quite important, the fact that there's almost a very divided response. Remember that a lot of Mexico, over 50% of the Mexican economy is informal. And so he's been rather, let's say, lenient with some of his lockdown measures, and which is obviously kind of favoring the poorer members of society who are kind of rely on informal source of income for their income. However, for the business sector, let's say the response or the perception has not been so favourable. And that's led the private sector to put in a number of steps in terms of business associations to really ensure that SMEs are protected and also kind of supply chains are protected as well. So it's a split picture, and I'm afraid to say it's not that favourable in terms of the point of view of many business people here.
Sure. And panning out now to the region as a whole, are there any sort of themes or trends we're getting in terms of the knock-on to supply chain? A number of Latin American countries are very dependent on their mining, for example, hydrocarbons. How's the supply chain challenges that the world is facing at the moment impacting those economies?
Well, I think we've got to look at this in kind of two strands. First of all, the short-term difficulties and headwinds, and also the long-term potential benefits. So a lot of Latin American countries are commodity exporters. So if we look at Argentina and Peru, huge commodity exporters, especially kind of soy, in the example of Argentina, which kind of has just had its harvest in kind of May and March, April, and that faced extreme challenges with kind of getting these goods to market and on boats to China. So even though the supply and demand is there, the very fact that we're living through a pandemic has been very difficult to ensure that those global supply chains have remained connected. But then if we look at the long-term aspects, I think there are potential benefits, and the immediate country that springs to mind is Mexico, of course. And so there have been many countries that have wanted to isolate themselves from China, maybe kind of draw back from China. That's something that we've covered at length in various analysis pieces at Oxford Business Group, and that has kind of knock-on effects positively for countries such as Vietnam, but principally for countries such as Mexico, which obviously shares a border with the US, and now has, well, from the kind of 1st of July, it now has a new free trade agreement with the US, so which will kind of almost allow it to further integrate its supply chain. So I think what we're going to see in the next, let's say, second half of the year and then into next year is kind of major companies, whether they're from the US or maybe Europe, who are looking to the US as their kind of principal market, maybe moving away factories and other plants from China to Mexico, especially kind of states along the border, such as Baja California. And so I think in the long term, we could see many, many benefits for the Mexican industrial sector.
Sure, and it's sort of a certain irony there, isn't there? That of course that dependence is not diminished, but enhanced almost in between the US and Mexico, and more broadly, some of the anti-globalization talk that we've heard of over the last 4 or 5 years, actually in some ways is being sort of reversed because of COVID-19 and all of the implications there.
Absolutely.
Moving on now, because I'm conscious of time. Are there any particular themes you're seeing amongst the responses that governments and central banks are putting in place in the region? When you look at some of the economies, there are some real notable horror stories in terms of government policy. Any themes?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's kind of two main kind of camps, as it were. There's the countries that made kind of decisive action and understood that implementing a strict lockdown immediately would kind of benefit them afterwards. And so countries come to mind such as Peru and Colombia, and then there's countries such as Brazil and Mexico who are led by well, I suppose populists, for want of a better word, at each end of the political spectrum, who are wanting to protect their base for political reasons, potentially. So if we look at the countries that have, let's say, done a more kind of implemented a more comprehensive lockdown, look at Peru, for example, it's put even, I suppose, compared to even some European countries, it's had a very complete response. It locked down very quickly, and it actually had, in terms of an economic stimulus, it had the region's biggest stimulus package, which is equivalent to about 12% of GDP. So that's been very interesting because it's been able to implement kind of measures such as universal basic income in the short term, but also kind of look at longer term measures through kind of bond sales. So I think Peru is a kind of standout example here of what can be done, and that is actually linked to its fiscal prudence over the last decade or so. But then if we look at, say, Mexico on the other end of the spectrum, it's also a country that's been fiscally prudent over the last decade, very kind of low debt to GDP ratio if we compare it to other G20 nations. However, AMLO, obviously the president of Mexico, he's got a very 1980s mentality. So he remembers the debt crisis, the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. So he's terrified of taking on more debt. So he's kind of implemented a less complete, let's say, stimulus package that's kind of equivalent to about 2 to 3% of GDP, and he's going to do that through austerity cuts. So I think it's very interesting to look at two countries such as Peru and Mexico that have gone into the crisis in quite similar fiscal stances, but kind of come out in very different ways.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops over time and which comes out as being right or more favorable for that economy.
Absolutely.
Finally, I wanted to just touch on digitalisation. So much of what we're covering at Oxford Business Group at the moment is these huge leaps and bounds in those yellow sliced countries that we cover in terms of suddenly increasing e-commerce, health tech, ed tech, all of those things. Again, Latin America, what's going on?
Well, I think more broadly, we're in a much better picture here. I think that this crisis will actually kind of be a catalyst for many digitalization measures across the whole continent, whether that be kind of in industry and manufacturing or in the service sector. So, if we look at Peru, for example, it's implemented a number of key measures to ensure that kind of free-flowing commerce through its borders, in ports and airports and on land borders, to make sure that all paperwork is done digitally. Now, it's interesting, we should even ask ourselves, why wasn't that done before? Why does it take a global pandemic to do this? So I think that's one example of how things can change if there is the necessity there. And then on the service side, we've seen kind of Medellin, which is the second largest city in Colombia, that's kind of actually known regionally for its innovative capacity. It's now the first country in Latin America to use kind of robots to deliver goods to and meals to residents, and that's come at a time when the country's on severe lockdown. So I think there are these measures here. The private sector is very strong and kind of very capable of innovating here. So I think that, again, the necessity of doing so is actually going to kind of pay dividends in the long term across the region.
I think we come back time and again, don't we, in these discussions to necessity being the mother of invention, and I'm sure that won't be the only invention that this crisis period is going to bring forward to us. Harry, thank you so much. A really interesting conversation. Look forward to carrying that on over the next coming weeks.
Thank you so much, Oliver.
Thank you.